adultery. The word itself conveys shame, even failure. But unless I miss my guess, every one of us knows someone who has committed it. It is clearly a serious matter. But does it mean the same thing today as it did when the Ten Commandments were written? Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. And this is your daily devotional for Wednesday, November 27th, 2024. Much as we don't like to think it, sexual mores have moved and shifted over the centuries. We often think that there has always been just one rigid, unbending standard. But simply consider this. In Old Testament times, there were plenty of examples of men having multiple wives, and there were even laws governing such marriage arrangements. Furthermore, judging by the different punishments attached to different sexual infractions, it is clear that the ancient Israelites could differentiate between more serious and less serious acts. But even with changing mores and standards, adultery has continued to be considered a serious matter. So what is it exactly? What did it mean back then? And what does it mean today? Now, contrary to popular opinion, the ancient Israelites were not some sexually repressed people who considered any sex outside of marriage to be completely taboo. Like today, people certainly engaged in sexual activity outside the bonds of marriage. The fact that the ancient Israelites developed a whole set of laws related to very specific sexual acts, each with a different consequence or punishment, attests to the fact that these various acts were common enough to require regulation. The various laws didn't just pop up out of nowhere, after all. They developed in relation to the actual realities of life in the ancient world, which turns out not to be that different from our own. But of all the different prohibited sexual offenses listed in the Old Testament, only one, adultery, made it into the Ten Commandments. Why? Well, let's be clear what adultery is. It is engaging in sex with a person who is married to another person, or it's a married person engaging with sex with someone other than one's spouse. It's not about sex between unmarried persons or a number of other possibilities. But even in the Old Testament, there were different levels of punishment for adultery, depending on the exact circumstance of it. In our day and age, we consider what goes on between consenting adults to be no one else's business, but there are still legal consequences for adultery, though not in the form of physical punishment. Rather, adultery becomes valid grounds for divorce. But no one is going to be taken into the city center and stoned to death, not anymore, at least not in our world. So adultery is and has been considered serious, in spite of the changing cultural mores and the evolving punishments or consequences for committing it. But what is it all about anyway? Some believe it is lodged in old property law, where a woman became a man's property when they married, and this was a way to protect the man's property. Well, perhaps that's true, but I think it's a pretty cynical approach. I think there's more going on than that. In the first place, as Old Testament scholar Walter Harrelson points out, it was a protection for married women in the ancient world, protection from being taken advantage of by any man who happened to fancy her. But more than that, it is a reminder that sexual unions are not to be taken lightly. We develop emotional attachments with our partners, attachments that are deep and abiding. Adultery has the ability almost uniquely to destroy the trust on which those attachments are built. And if we know anything about what the Bible teaches in general terms, it is that there is a lot of weight placed on the integrity of relationships. And anything that harms or destroys human relationships is almost by definition a violation of God's intention for life in human community. We were created for life in community. We weren't created to be random individuals looking out only for ourselves. We were built to be in community with one another. And whatever threatens the bonds of community, whether it is the marriage bond or the larger web of relationships in which we live, whatever it is to be protected against. Look, adultery happens. It happened in the ancient world, and it happens now. We no longer put people to death for it as they did in the ancient world, at least not in Western countries, but we take it seriously nevertheless. Can relationships be strained by adultery, be healed? Of course, but there will always be scar tissue in the relationship. Far, far better to heed the command than risk destroying precious relationships. That's what's at stake. Tomorrow, the prohibition against stealing. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.